of Toastmaster speeches. And one idea that I thought would be interesting is trying something where we explore negotiations in a team setting, or maybe even in an individual setting as a speech. I'm actually currently taking a class about negotiation tactics, and I learned a lot of interesting things that I didn't really expect to understand before. And I thought it would be interesting to share with all of you today and motivate some of you to be thinking about negotiations as a new speech format. So with that, I'll get started with this sample scenario that I've constructed here. A lot of people like to use salary negotiations as an example of how to negotiate, but I think that's too niche, and it often leads people to overfit their ideas of how to negotiate properly when they're approaching any kind of scenario in life. So the scenario I've constructed here is between BMW, the car company, and KUKA, which is a company that sells robots that are used in automotive factories. So the idea here is that BMW is negotiating with KUKA to buy a new batch of robots for their factory, and the two are negotiating for the price of the robot that they're going to buy, that BMW is going to buy. Now, there's a few terms on here that I want to define, which is aspiration point and resistance point. So each party on this slide has an aspiration point, meaning the ideal goal that they want for the price of the robot, whether that's the robot they're selling in the case of KUKA or the robot they're buying in the case of BMW. At the same time, there's also a resistance point, which is essentially the point at which you are willing to drop this negotiation. That's the point at which BMW would say, you know what? No, thanks. I don't really want to take part in the negotiation if I'm going to pay that much money for this robot. It's pretty clear to see that the zone that we're operating between, which is called the zone of potential agreements, is between this $150,000 to $175,000, where the two parties can come to some kind of middle ground, some kind of agreement that can result in an actual contract. Now, the other parts of this map are what I like to refer to as the parts where you wipe the deal off the table. For example, let's say KUKA is very stubborn in their part of this negotiation, and they insist on BMW paying something like $190,000 per robot. Well, the representative for BMW should maintain that resistance point and say, again, we're simply not able to do that. There's no way we're paying $190,000 per robot when your competitors are selling at lower price points, or when we've previously had contracts at much more reasonable prices. So it's important that regardless of whatever side of the deal you're on, your resistance point is a fixed value that you can commit to with confidence in a calm way. It's not a good sign if the opponent or the partner can see your resistance point changing during the negotiation. It's a signal of a lack of confidence and a lack of knowledge about yourself in this deal. One caveat I want to make here, though, is that you want to avoid immediately accepting the offer that the other side provides. This is actually a phenomenon called a winner's curse, where if the other side provides a deal that seems too good to you and you immediately accept it, chances are there are some covenants or some contract, some details in the contract that you simply don't know about, and they're sweetening the deal initially to make it seem like it's great for you, but more often than not, there's something that you're missing there. So it's a good idea to be careful about that. Now, another term I want to go over here is something called the BOTNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement. The BOTNA is essentially your alternative if you were to drop the negotiation and walk away from the table. So let's say, for example, BMW has another company that's a competitor to KUKA that they're trying to buy the robot from. That's actually their best alternative to negotiating with KUKA. So the important thing before any negotiation is to make your alternative as strong as possible, but to also never reveal to the other side if you have a weak alternative, because then that gives them a lot of leverage in this negotiation. One thing that's clever is using something called a phantom BOTNA, which is essentially bluffing the other side into thinking that you have a great alternative when maybe you don't actually have such a great alternative. For example, BMW could say, you know, I'm actually in talks with robot company B about another offer at a lower price point and at a much sweeter deal than you have right now. Therefore, KUKA should be incentivized to come in a more friendly manner to the table going forward. Now, this all seems pretty basic because I've only talked about one aspect of the whole contract, which is the money for the robot itself. But there's a concept in negotiations called building a package or expanding the pie, which refers to the idea that there's actually a lot of other components to building a deal other than cost. For example, you could talk about the number of robots you're buying, the volume, the services or warranties that come with the robot. And these are all different aspects of the deal that BMW and KUKA can tweak to reach a settlement together, rather than focusing on just one of these factors or the other. There's also something called linkage effects that I think is interesting, which is, let's say BMW today has a very good deal with KUKA. They have to consider the fact that building a relationship with KUKA today can let them make better negotiations in the future. So it's important to think of any kind of negotiation in real life as a stepping stone to a long-term, mutually beneficial relationship, rather than a one-off event that will never have any consequences. Okay, these are all very basic but very sterile environment negotiations, as I like to call it, because in real life, a lot of things can go wrong. So I want to take a look at some of these examples. The first of which is you're probably not going to get a deal that you like immediately. So you're going to have to make some concessions along the way. And one interesting thing about concessions is that it's important to make concessions gradually, because if you make concessions too quickly or in too large of a size, it can actually create some suspicion from the other side. And they can think that maybe you're actually not being honest with them about what your concessions are, and maybe you have some other things that you're hiding from them. Of course, when you're making concessions, you want to make sure that you're asking for something in return so that you're not just giving up your side of the deal. The other thing that happens a lot in real life is anger. Some people get very emotional during negotiations, and it can cause a lot of frustration or tension and really be counterproductive to both parties. There's tactical anger, which is when people are not actually angry, but they're trying to use anger as a power move. And they're trying to signal to the other side that they don't actually have much leverage, but they're going to use their anger as sort of a bully tactic to make sure that they can get their desired outcome. The difference between tactical anger and genuine anger is that if someone is genuinely angry, as you make more and more concessions and come to an agreement with them, their anger should fade. Whereas if they're bluffing you and being tactically angry, their anger won't rationally fade with acknowledgement. It'll just sort of stay there as a mask for their true emotions. The final thing I want to wrap up with is the idea of apologies. A lot of negotiations have apologies where, let's say, you're about to be threatened by a lawsuit and you need to apologize to the other side to prevent yourself from entering into a lawsuit. It's important to follow this procedure with apologies that it seems very structured and very formalized, but I think there are two components to this that are particularly important, which is the acknowledgement of responsibility and the offer of repair. A lot of apologies end up seeming hollow or meaningless because the side apologizing may explain what went wrong. They may offer the phrase sorry or I apologize for my mistake, but they never actually take the step of saying it's my mistake, but more than that, here's what I'll do to recover the cost for you, or here's what I'll do to make sure that you understand we appreciate your perspective on this issue. So I think the final point is just to have that empathetic relationship and make it clear to the other side that you understand where they're going. So with all of this, how is this related to Toastmasters? I think it would be very interesting to enter into some kind of team negotiation for the club where we can come up with a scenario, and instead of a panel discussion or let's say some of the other ideas we had for speeches, we have a group of negotiators that can debate against the other group of negotiators. And each team will have a lead whose responsibility is to put forth these offers and counteroffers, as well as other roles where they can sit back and make decisions for the negotiation. And I think this is a mix of like an impromptu session like table topics, but also a more formal speaking style where you have to establish relationships and build deals. So with that, I think we can take some ideas away, but I hope you enjoyed this speech and thank you for listening.